All right, so let's get started. My name's Jerry McMillan. I'm a UROP advisor, and you are here for the workshop on presenting effectively for our symposium. So, a couple of questions before we start. First of all, how many of you came to either the poster prep or oral prep workshops we did over the last couple of weeks? Okay, so about half of you have seen me before and come back. Thank you. How many of you are signed up to do oral presentations at the symposium? Okay. Poster? Okay, so just so you know, the way we're going to run this is I'm going to talk mostly about oral presentations through most of this specifically. What that means is I'm going to talk about oral presentations, but a lot of the things we talk about will apply very nicely to doing a poster as well. And then I'll give some thoughts on posters just before we quit, specific poster-related information. So for those of you that have been at one of my workshops on Symposium before, what is an oral presentation specifically, but what is a presentation? For an oral presentation, the answer is it's standing in front of a room and talking. I'm doing an oral presentation right now. You might use illustrations. For those of you that were at the oral prep, you've seen this slide before, which means for those of you that weren't here last week, or anybody, how many of you are planning to do a PowerPoint presentation? I am going to suggest, I put that up too early, I'm going to suggest that you redefine that in your mind. You are not going to do a PowerPoint presentation, and the reasoning behind that is, as I interpret the phrase PowerPoint presentation, what comes to mind is I put up a bunch of slides and then I talk about them. Rather, I want you to think that you are doing a presentation and using slides to illustrate what you're talking about. So an oral presentation is a person standing in front of a room using perhaps illustrative devices such as PowerPoint. And with that in mind, again, those of you that have been here before have seen this slide as well. What are the goals of a presentation? Any of you remember, or anybody have any offerings on that? To capture interest, definitely one of them. One basic goal. If you had to define why you are doing a presentation in, say, one word, what would that word be? Thank you. Oh, I got these in the wrong order. The primary goal of your presentation is to communicate. And this is true whether you're doing an oral or a poster presentation. Your job is to have something that you know, and you are trying to find a way to share that information with your audience. You want to do it in a way that captures interest, and you also want to do it in a way that inspires your audience to know more about what you're saying. One of the best things that can come out of a presentation is when you're done, people want to ask questions. And not the questions of, okay, I didn't get it. What'd you say about 10 minutes ago? But you want the questions of, okay, you talked about this. Can you tell me more about it? You want to say things in a way that people want to know more about what you've said. So before we go on, I'm sure all of us have seen presentations that in some way or another did not meet those goals. Think about those presentations you've seen. What did you see that didn't work? Reading off slides, definitely.
No eye contact, just no cards or slides.
No eye contact with the audience. Very good. What else?
Lack of visuals.
Lack of visuals. That's one I haven't heard mentioned before, but very good, but a good one. What else? I know we've all seen lousy presentations. What else have you seen that doesn't work? Or heard? Yep. A monotonous tone. I had one quarter in college way back when, well, way back, I had a 7 a.m. class and the professor had a monotone. It was bad. What else? Those are good things to think about. I'll get to all of them as we're going on, but think about this. We talked about you want to generate interest. So how do you generate interest from an audience? And I want you to think at this point about two things. First of all, when you begin, how are you going to get their attention? In every room at the symposium, there is going to be somebody, probably a faculty member, doing all of the introductions. Picture this. I have seen this from countless presenters. Our next presenter will be Jerry McMillan, and he's going to talk about presenting effectively. Hi, I'm Jerry McMillan, and I'm going to talk about presenting effectively. Does that seem a little redundant to any of you? Were most of you thinking you'd start that way anyway, simply because it seems like the appropriate way to start? Most of the students most presenters I see in this sort of situation start that way. But if you've got somebody already giving your name and title, it's done. You don't need to do that. So start thinking about how you can actually get the audience with you from the first words you utter. Couple of things. First of all, I would avoid just a hi, because it basically says, I'm nervous, I'm trying to establish my space, and not say anything scary up front. Think about a couple of possibilities. First of all, you can always start a presentation with a question, even a rhetorical question. Have any of you thought about what it's like to do a presentation before? If I'd started that way, you would immediately start thinking, have I? Your mind's engaged. If you're doing a presentation on, I don't know, the chemical structure of shark teeth, have you ever thought about what shark's teeth are made of? Most of the people are going to think in their mind, no, but they've started thinking about what you've said. So starting a presentation with a question is a great way to get your audience engaged. Another thing is just start with a very powerful statement. Probably none of you will be able to say this, but over the last 3 quarters on my project, we've found a cure for cancer. Is there anybody in the audience, any of you, that would not immediately sit up and say, tell me more? So if there's something in your results, something you've discovered through your project, that your audience is immediately going to be able to relate to and will find cool, start with that. Just make a basic statement. And then when you've got the attention, then say, let me tell you how I got there. You've got their attention now. Even if it's just start with a bold statement or a question and then go into the formalities like, over the last quarters, I've studied under Professor so-and-so and my project, blah, blah. If you want to give that sort of information up front, great, but start with something that catches attention. And then at the other end of it, what do you want people to walk away from your presentation thinking? How many times have you seen a presentation that just devolves in, here are my references, and I'd like to thank my professor, and sources of funding, and any questions? Think about how to sum up what you've just talked about in one sentence. What's the single most important thing you said? What do you want people walking away with? So something like, after all we've talked about, the one thing I want you to remember is that shark's teeth are incredibly closely related to Doritos. Okay, just made that up. Any questions? So and there will be a Q&A section or session immediately after you talk, so any questions is entirely appropriate. But what do you say right before then that leaves your audience thinking about what you want them to think about? Finish with a statement. Don't just sort of dribble out at the end and let things die. Do the formalities, but then finish with a statement. Just as a note, for those of you doing oral presentations, you'll have 10 minutes for your presentation. You will be assigned a 15-minute slot within a 1-hour session. So as you're thinking about it, plan on 10 minutes, then you'll have 2 or 3 minutes for Q&A, and then a minute or 2 for you to sit down, next person to stand up. And just as an etiquette thing, we'll say this a lot between now and the symposium, please plan on being in the room for that entire 1-hour session as a note of respect to the other presenters. I have seen it happen where a student presents, and as soon as they're done, they, their grandmother, 3 aunts, 2 sisters, 8 lab mates all get up and walk out, leaving the next person in the room with a faculty moderator and a UROP volunteer. You wouldn't want to be that person, so don't do it to somebody else in your room. That's probably the only lecture I'll give you this afternoon, but think about, please plan to stay in the room for the entire 1-hour session. So you've gotten your audience's attention. You've left them with a powerful thought. I'm going to spend the rest of this time talking about what happens in between that. The first thing you want to do is make sure you know what you're going to talk about. At a very basic level, you're all going to be talking about a research project you've spent a lot of time working on, so you do know your material. But do you know how you're going to talk about that material? First of all, for those of you that are planning your presentation of going ahead, how many of you are planning to completely memorize all of the words in your presentation and speak off of a memorized script? I love the fact that, first of all, nobody raised their hand, and second of all, I actually saw some people go, because rule number 1, do not memorize your script. Memorizing your script is something that a lot of people think is a great way to approach it because you know exactly what you're going to say, which is also the problem. If you have a perfectly memorized script and then you forget a word, you have just run your train of thought off of the rails. And the only way you can get back is remembering that one next word. Instead, memorize your outline. Know exactly the direction you want to go, know exactly the areas you want to talk about, and then if you get off, you can just ask yourself, okay, where was I? Oh, I know how to talk about that, and start talking again. If you miss a little bit, fine, but at least you'll be able to get back, you'll get that train back onto the tracks. That almost triggered a thought, and I forgot what it was, so I'll get to it later. Something else, as you are going on, if you're not memorizing, how do you remember what you're going to say? Create effective notes. If you're using PowerPoint, maybe you're using the note feature. As was mentioned earlier, do not stand here and talk to the notes while you're thinking about what you're saying. If you don't want to use the PowerPoint note feature, which frankly I don't like because, well, my eyes are a lot older than yours, something I like to do is I print out notes on just basic 8.5 by 11, but the notes I print out tend to be about 18-point type, which means I can see them from here, which means I can wander around as much as I feel is appropriate or is comfortable and still see my notes. So when you're making yourself notes, think about how animated you might be during your presentation. And I really recommend don't hide back here because, well, I'll talk about nerves a little bit later. But think about how you're going to present and think about how you're going to see your notes. I really recommend find a format that's visible from a distance. Because then even if you are looking at your notes, they don't know you're looking at your notes. So it looks a little more professional. And then as you are working on your presentation, you want to practice. And you want to learn from that practice. And then you want to do it again. The more you practice your presentation, the cleaner it's going to be when you're actually doing it in front of an audience. Again, don't memorize it. Every time you practice it, it may be a little different. That's fine. But every time you practice it, it'll be a little bit cleaner. The more you practice it, the more you'll be used to just talking your way through your presentation. And then something really important while you're practicing, time yourself. As I said, you have 10 minutes for your presentation. If you go over time, one of two things will happen, and neither is good. First of all, we will ask our faculty moderators to time you and make sure you stop within time. They may cut you off. I have seen it happen where somebody is giving a presentation and they get to the point where they say, but the single most important thing about that I'm going to say is, sorry, stop. Don't let that be you, because we want to know the single most important thing you have to say. The other thing that can happen is the faculty moderator will not stop you when you go over time, which means the next presenters have less time because you've hogged all the time in the session. Again, as a sign of respect to your fellow presenters, make sure you're done on time so that they have enough time to finish their presentation. As a general rule for me, if I have a 10-minute limit, I practice to 9 minutes and adjust my presentation accordingly, because when you get in front of an audience, all sorts of things can happen. You can forget what you're saying. Somebody may interrupt you with a question. You may just discover in front of an audience you talk a little slower than you do normally. You may also find in front of an audience you talk a whole lot faster than you do normally. That's also fine. But if you practice to 9 minutes for your 10-minute presentation, you've got enough wiggle room that if things change, you can still fill the time comfortably. So know your presentation. Get good notes, practice it, time it. And then when you start getting in front of an audience, think about how you're gonna talk. There's one basic rule you should all keep in mind, which is make sure people can hear you and you're talking in something that they can understand. Some of you probably have very soft voices. We will have a variety of rooms in which people are presenting. Probably none of them are very large. But I do recommend check out your room before you get up to present. Whether you're there, and I recommend this 10 minutes before the session begins, or you'll know your room in advance, wander by, see what it looks like. But even in a small room, I've had people talk so softly you just can't hear them. So make sure you're talking loudly enough that people can hear you. For most people, just a conversational tone of voice is fine. Also speak clearly. For some people, that may be a challenge for a variety of reasons. Some people just don't talk very clearly, don't enunciate their words. Okay, if you are that person, you know it by now. This is a time to enunciate. Maybe you have a very thick accent. Maybe English is a second language. If it is, you know you need to speak a little more slowly just so people can interpret what you say. But the two basic rules, speak loudly enough that people can hear you, speak clearly enough that they can understand what you're saying. When I asked up front for things people have seen in bad presentations, one that's frequently mentioned that nobody did here is a lot of people say, don't talk too fast. And I actually disagree with that. Because for a lot of people, their normal speaking pace is really fast. And if you are a person that normally speaks really quickly and can be understood at that pace, speak very quickly, because forcing yourself to slow down just because you think you need to speak slower is very mechanical, stilted, and uncomfortable. So speak at a pace that is both comfortable for you and that can be understood by the audience. However, if you are somebody who speaks quickly naturally, and you find that your presentation style is to speak very quickly, that's fine. And the faster you speak, the more often you need to stop. I always have an image in my mind when I'm thinking about presentations. When you start talking, picture a train leaving the station, starts going down the tracks. At the same time your train leaves, think about all those cartoons or old westerns you've seen where the people get on and they've got that little pump car that goes down the tracks only much slower than a train. Your audience is on one of those. And the faster you talk, the further you're going to get ahead of your audience. You need to stop and let them catch up so they can digest what you're talking about. And then the train will start and the car will start after them again. So at whatever pace you're talking, just make sure you give your audience a chance to catch up occasionally. Fast you talk, the more often, the longer you need to do that. Make sure you don't leave your audience stuck at the station. Something else to think about. What do you think is going to be the single most uttered word at the symposium? You can also make a case for you know, anyway. All of these words, well, let me ask this. What do you think is the definition of the word You're laughing. I do have a definition. Anybody have a definition for I don't know. Exactly. I'm going to expand that slightly. The definition of is, I don't know what to say next. And there are a couple of things you can do to limit your ums. First of all, going back to the previous slide, know what you're going to say. The better you know what you're going to say, the less likely you are to need to say, hang on just a minute while I get my thoughts in order. Another great way to avoid saying or equivalent is just to say nothing. If you get to the spot where you don't know what to say, just stop. let your mind focus through some things, scroll around, and if it's not an enormous amount of time, they won't even notice. On a related note, I always work this in somewhere in this workshop. Be sure when you are in front of an audience, unless you do something horribly egregious like spill your coffee on somebody, do not apologize while you are doing a presentation. In almost every case, the apologies I see are somebody gets off their train of thought for a moment, says, I'm sorry, okay, I'll start again. Almost every time I see that happen, I hadn't noticed what they're apologizing for. So all you're doing by apologizing is calling attention, hey, screwed up. And in many cases, they won't have noticed. In most cases, they won't care because, they're human too. They've probably made a mistake. And in the third case, again, you're human. It happens. So unless it's something really big and something that you think is utterly unforgivable, don't apologize. Just accept it as part of being in front of an audience and going ahead. If you fumble your words, that's normal, that's natural. If you lose your train of thought for a moment, that's fine. But apologizing just calls attention to the fact that you screwed up. So please don't. I've already mentioned this a couple of times, but probably the single best tool in any presenter's arsenal is the pause. And it can serve a huge variety of purposes. We've already talked about a couple. If you don't know what to say next, silence is great. Obviously, you can do too much of it. But as you're doing your presentation, also think about this. If you're reading a book and you get to the end of a sentence, there's a period. You know that thought has closed. You get to the end of a paragraph. That one ends, there's an indentation or a space before it. You know the thought has changed. You get to the end of a chapter, you have to turn a completely different page. There's a huge number and all sorts of stuff on top of the next page before you start. None of that exists when you're talking, unless you put it there. So when you get to the end of a sentence, stop for a moment and then start again. We've all heard people who say, okay, now I am finishing this thought, so the next thought I'm talking about is this. And they just run it together and it is confusing. I'm finishing this thought. Now I'll start in on something new. Okay, the audience goes, oh, okay, readjustment. Made it, done, going. The problem with pausing in this way for a lot of people presenting is it feels incredibly awkward to stop talking and just standing in front of an audience doing nothing. So what I would suggest is if you are one of those people for whom that feels incredibly awkward and uncomfortable, get used to doing it in normal speech. As you are talking to people, just get to a point and stop talking and pause for 3 seconds. If you are new to this concept, 3 seconds is going to feel incredibly uncomfortable. And yet, how many of you were incredibly uncomfortable for any of those 3-second pauses I just did? It's a very comfortable pace to listen to. You just have to get used to doing it. So as I say, if you are not comfortable punctuating your speech with silence, it's a great habit to practice. and it really makes you look polished. Because particularly if you're one of those people who speaks very quickly and people get really into the pace that you're speaking and you just go on and everybody's thinking, wow, this is incredible, he's got so much to say and that's great, and they're thinking, please let me stop for a moment. You stop. And then you can start again. So pausing is a great way to communicate things. It's also a great way to tell your audience something really is important to come. Rather than saying, so the most important thing is this, and then start talking about it. So the most important thing about it, the most important thing is this. Pause, dramatic moment. People say, whoa, what is it? And then you start talking. You can use a pause to generate interest. After you say something really important, stop for a moment to let your audience, let them think about it for a moment. Let them internalize it. But learn to use a pause. It's an incredibly effective and important tool. And as I say, the more you work that into your speaking style, the more professional and comfortable you'll start sounding. So all these things for speaking effectively. Let's move on to the next one. And when I first asked about things that people saw very badly, a couple of them were in this category. As I mentioned up front, try to think of your presentation as you, with slides as an illustration. We've heard the one, and I know you've all seen it. Do not look at the screen while you're talking. All you do by doing that is say, hey, I'm reading it, you should probably read it too. And in fact, just kind of ignore me because all the important stuff's over there. This is exactly the attitude we want them not to have. So know what you're going to say. Occasionally you may find you want to refer to your slides, particularly if you forget what you're talking about. Then you can look at your slides and say, oh, okay, that's where I am. They're good reminders. But in general, do not look at your slides. And specifically, if you're looking at your slides or if you're changing your slides, stop talking. Something we don't think about very often. Every time what's on the screen changes, your audience is going to read what's there. And if they're reading what's there, they're not listening to you. So as a general rule, and frankly, I've never watched myself to see if I do this, and I probably don't do it very well, but if you're going to change a slide, stop talking, change it, and then start talking again. But while you are mechanically going through the process of making a change, don't say anything. Let your audience read what's there, let them accept what's there, and then start talking again. For those of you that were at the workshop last week where we talked about what to put on slides, this is part of the reason not to put a whole lot of stuff on your slides, because if you do, they're going to be reading for a lot longer. Give them time to read what's up there. Something else that most people don't think about is sometimes you've got slides that have some information and then you want to talk about something completely different for a little while. And if you depart from what's directly on the screen, particularly for any length of time, 30 seconds or more, your audience is going to look at the slide, listen to what you're talking about, and think, what does this have to do with that? Or should he have changed the slide by now? Or what's going on? So there's a very simple tool. If you're doing that, turn off the display. If you've got a clicker, there's a button to do it. If you don't have a clicker, click the B key on your keyboard. It will blank the display. Now you can talk to people without that visual disconnect going on in their minds. When you're done and ready to go on, bring the display back. But as you're thinking about the pace of your presentation, think, are there times that turning the slide off might be beneficial? As I say, it's a tool very few people I've seen use, but it can be incredibly valuable if you want to expand on something to a degree that you just want them to stop thinking about what's there and just focus on you. If you are using visual aids, whether it's a picture, whether it's a graph, a chart, an equation, explain it. When you're building your slide, most of that information should be there, but talk about it. Talk about what's on it. Talk about why you are showing it and what they should be taking away from seeing it. How does this visual element of your slide impact what they should be thinking about your presentation? And something to think about while you're doing this, a lot of people will put up an illustration or something and use a laser pointer to point at it. A laser pointer is another one of those really powerful tools that most people use really badly. My general rule for using a laser pointer is don't. But if you need to, think about a couple of things. First of all, remember, if you are focusing on the laser pointer, you are not looking at your audience. You are not making eye contact. So limit the amount of time you're doing it. Or better yet, point at something, know your hand is steady enough, mine isn't, that you can talk to your audience while that pointer remains in place. Also think about when you are done pointing, make sure you turn the thing off, because I have seen people wave that thing around for minutes just because their thumb hasn't let go. It can be really distracting. If there's a cat in a room, they'll go nuts trying to follow that dot around. Also, the biggest problem I see with laser pointers is people say, ooh, I have this. I should use it all the time. Have you ever seen somebody use a pointer to say, and so as you can see from the top left corner of my slide, and then point at the top left corner of their slide? Anybody seen the equivalent of that? I'm betting most of you have. Is there anybody in this room that cannot find the top left corner of a slide on their own? My bet is your audience can too. So if there's a very specific part of the image you want to call out, or a single line on your chart, yeah, use it. But use it deliberately. Make sure you're pointing to something that you can't point at another way. And then put it down and walk away until the next time you need it. So use it if it's necessary. Otherwise, don't. It can be far more distracting than not using it. Something else to think about while you're presenting: attitude. I couldn't think of a better heading for this slide, but let me talk about it. When people are looking at you, what's the attitude you're conveying to them? First of all, think about this. You're all talking about something that you have dedicated hours, days, weeks, months of your undergrad career to pursuing. I am hoping at this point in your research, most of you are still really excited about what you've spent this time on. So the first thing I would suggest when you're presenting is be excited about it. You're talking about something that I hope you think is really cool. Let your audience feel that. Because if you are excited, they will be too. I know all of us have seen somebody get up there and basically say, through their nonverbals, I don't want to be here talking about this. I don't care about this topic. I don't care if any of you walk out remembering a thing I say. Let's just get through these 10 minutes. Don't be that person. You're talking about something you've invested a lot in. It's something that has meant something to you for a long time. Remember that and convey that sense. And they will be with you. Just as a note, a lot of people, and I'm going to talk more about this, but a lot of people get up in front of an audience and think, they're looking at me, they're judging me. All they can think about is everything I'm doing wrong. It's natural. They're not really judging you except maybe your mentor and your dad. What they're there for is to listen to what you're talking about, to learn from you. Be excited about that. They'll forget to think about judging you. So be excited about what you're talking about. And we talked about this earlier. Somebody mentioned it. Make eye contact with your audience. And for a lot of people, this is the scariest part of doing a presentation. But it's important for people in your audience to think that you are talking to them. And so go around the room every now and then, look somebody directly in the eye, talk just to them for a few seconds, and then move on to somebody else. Be very aware that a lot of us have a reflex to only talk to half the room. Don't ignore those people over there or the people over there. Spread your attention around the room. This is a weird room because I end up with so many more people over here that I try not to forget you folks. But be aware that you're that you're looking at everybody in the room. And while you're thinking about eye contact, a couple of things to avoid. First of all, there is the scan method of I'm just going to make eye contact with everybody in the room by just scanning the room constantly. That just looks weird. And it's not really engaging anybody in particular. Know for a fact you probably won't be able to get everybody in the room, particularly if you have a large crowd. Know also, particularly in this era of masks, if you look at somebody, you may not get any sort of reaction. But as you're first starting to talk to people, you will notice there will be somebody sitting out there somewhere that's just sitting there like this, eager to listen to you, or they're smiling at you. Make eye contact with them a lot, because that's a great safe place to return to. Something else to think about. In terms of eye contact, as I said, this is uncomfortable for a lot of us. So if you find, as you're standing in front of an audience, that you just cannot look somebody in the eye and maintain your focus and keep going, a really good cheat is just find a spot about a foot over the head of the person in the last row and just look at that elevation, because people aren't really going to notice you're not looking directly at them, but at least you're maintaining focus throughout the room, moving that focus around, but you're not having to see them looking right back at you, which can be a little nerve-wracking. So if you're not comfortable directly relating to people, just find a point a little over their heads. It's a nice, safe place to go. And then this is probably the one piece of advice you're going to hear from a lot of people and will have the hardest time doing. While you are in front of an audience, relax. Find a way to be comfortable in what is an incredibly uncomfortable situation. One great way to relax, and the thing that none of us ever think about while we're presenting, is keep breathing. particularly if you are one of those people who gets nervous, speaks really quickly, accelerates like mad, it is really easy to forget to breathe. And you start going on and you're going on faster and faster and you keep talking, you keep thinking about other things to say, and sooner or later you run out of breath. Just stop. Breathe. Our breath ultimately is what keeps us able to do this sort of thing. So it's another one of those great reflexes to build in with pausing. Every time you pause, just think, take a breath. The more you can keep breathing throughout this presentation, the easier time you'll have getting back to that relaxed state. Another thing about relaxing, and again, it's an uncomfortable situation. Another thing about relaxing, the more you practice your presentation, the more comfortable you are with what you're going to talk about, the easier it'll be up here. Which brings me to one very specific note. People always ask, so how can I do a presentation and not be nervous? And the very simple answer is, you can't. And in fact, if you find yourself up speaking in front of an audience and you are not the least bit nervous or the least bit anxious, you should probably seek medical attention. This is scary. I mean, how many polls have shown that speaking in public is one of the single top things of anxiety-inducing fears in human beings? But think about this. From the point of view of a non-professional, what do you think is the difference between standing up in front of an audience and being incredibly nervous or standing in front of an audience and being incredibly excited? And the answer is basically nothing. They're both adrenaline reactions. It's the instinct that in our long-distant ancestors basically said, a tiger, run! But the difference in terms of doing a presentation, the difference between being, I can't do this, and this is amazing, the only difference is how you deal with that adrenaline. And if you are comfortable with what you're talking about, if you're excited about your topic, you'll forget to be nervous. And then when you're done, you'll sit down and start shaking like a leaf and realize, oh, that should have been really scary, but I had so much fun, I didn't notice. I used to do a lot more public speaking some years ago, and every time I sat down, I would sit next to my wife, and the first thing I would do when I sat next to her is hold out my hand, and usually it would be going like this. But when I was doing the presentation, I was having a blast, as you probably noticed I am now. So the nerves don't get there. So the more excited you can be about what you're talking about, the more you can forget this is supposed to be scary. And then you have all day afterwards to think, wow, that should have been scary. And think, but it wasn't. And feel very smug about how cool that was. And as a note, the more often you do this sort of thing, absolutely the easier it gets. I've done a lot of these. Am I still a little nervous when I get in front of a crowd? Absolutely. But I'm comfortable enough doing it that it doesn't bother me anymore. So if you're nervous about getting in front of an audience and talking, accept that fact. And then just focus on how cool what you're talking about is. And you'll find it much easier to get through it. Related to that, speak with confidence. As I've said, you're going to be talking about something you've spent a whole lot of time working on. You are there in the room as the authority figure on your topic. People are there to listen to what you have to say about your subject. Enjoy that fact. This is a chance to share something that's really cool and related to that. While you are the expert on your topic, recognize you do not know everything about your topic. So question, if somebody asks you something and you don't know the answer, what do you do?
Say you don't know?
That's half of it. And that's great. It's an important thing. I mean, you're all experts on your field, but you are still undergrads. You don't know everything. Neither does anybody else. So what do you think the second half of that is?
How you'll tackle the answer, like different ways.
Exactly. I don't know, and there can be a variety of answers to that. First of all, maybe your faculty mentors in the room, they're an expert on this field more than you are. Professor, can you help me with this one? Perfectly fine. I don't know, but if you give me your email address, I'll look it up and let you know. You have just given them an indication that their question is important to you and given yourself a chance to learn more about your topic. So the important thing is, if you don't know an answer, own up to it, be humble. It'll be uncomfortable. Nobody said this would be easy. But it also gives you a chance to tell your audience, look, I'm an honest person. I don't know all the answers, but I do want to help you. So let me find a way to get to that answer. And then I promised this would come. We've talked about generally oral presentations, but let's talk about some specific stuff if you are presenting a poster. First of all, as I just mentioned, pretty much anything that doesn't involve PowerPoint that I've said so far applies to doing a poster. It's still speaking in front of an audience. It's just your audience is much smaller and standing much closer to you. But everything like pausing, being confident, practicing, all of that stuff still applies. If you're doing a poster, basically the format is, here is a piece of styrofoam paper, whatever it is, you're standing next to it, people will walk up, look at your thing, and ask you questions about it. So the first thing you want to know is, what questions are you going to be asked? And I can guarantee the one question you will be asked the most is something along the lines of, so, what's this about? Or, tell me about your research, or something like that. Knowing that this is coming is valuable. But knowing that one's going to be the most often asked, what are the other questions you're going to be asked? And there's only one way to know that. When you're preparing your poster, better before it's printed, before you've spent the money on printing it, show it to people. Show it to people in your lab, show it to people related to your field, and show it to people who know nothing about your field. And tell them to ask you questions. And if 6 people ask the same question, 2 things. First of all, if you haven't printed the poster yet, maybe you can change something so that they don't have to ask that question. If you don't want to change it, you know that question's coming. So you can prepare an answer for it. So as you start giving people the opportunity to look at your poster, as you start understanding what the questions are that are going to be coming, you can start preparing answers. I highly recommend for the, so what's your research about question? Plan an answer that is no more than about 2 minutes long. Practice that answer as often as you can. Know it'll be asked different ways, but your basic, this is what my research is about, you're going to be using that one several times. Be ready for it. And then all those other questions you get asked that you think may come up more than once, prepare answers for those. The more you're ready to answer the questions that are going to come up often, the more mental energy you'll have for those questions that catch you by surprise. So plan as many answers as you can going forward. That way you're ready for those. But you can also give the surprising ones a little bit more thought and a little bit more effort. So doing a poster, it's very similar to doing an oral presentation. It's just different. But it's still talking for people. Prepare for it as well as you can. Another note about the poster presentation, when we were talking long ago about speak audibly, know that generally a poster session can be really loud, noisy, crowded, all of those things. So if you are normally a very soft-spoken person, you may not be heard. Back when we were doing the symposium in the Student Center, we do practice your presentation sessions, and I'll talk a little bit more about those coming up, but those are generally aimed for oral presentations, but every now and then somebody would come in with a poster and say, how do I practice doing a poster presentation? And what we would do is we would divide the number of people in the room in half and invite about half the people in the room to come up, look at the poster, and ask questions about it. And then invite everybody else in the room to make as much noise as they possibly could so that the person answering the questions got used to doing it in a chaotic, noisy environment. Can't always simulate that, but assume that's going to be fairly close to reality if you're doing a poster. So a couple of thoughts as we close down. First of all, I want you to think about first of all, there is a QR code at the bottom of the screen. For those of you that have been to our workshops before, you know what that is. It'll take you to a short survey, and if you don't follow it now, you will get this same link in a follow-up email from us. But our job in doing these workshops is to give you as much information as we can about things that are coming up. Our goal is to make sure you learn everything you want to know about this topic. And the only way we know if we're doing this effectively is if you tell us. So please go to the survey. It's short, I think it's 5 or 6 questions. Let us know if we're doing things particularly well. Let us know if there are things we can improve, because that's the only way we can make sure we're doing these workshops as effectively as we can. So I know when you get to the point that somebody says, and I want you to fill out this survey, the immediate reaction is, no, not gonna. It's my reaction, I will absolutely admit that, but please overcome that. For the people who come to this workshop next year, we want to make it better, so let us know how we can. And then think about this. 3 thoughts. I think it's 3. I want you to walk away with. First of all, your goal in doing this presentation is to communicate. If the audience walks away learning what you're trying to tell them, your presentation is a success. Second, keep in mind, you are the presentation. Whether you're doing an oral presentation or a poster, the thing you want people to focus on is what you are telling them. The poster, the PowerPoint are illustrations. They enhance what you are telling them. They illustrate. They give more information. But the presentation is you. And finally, you're talking about something I hope you think is really cool and amazing. As human beings, we like to share things that excite us. So as you're talking about that, just focus on how cool this is, what you're talking about, how exciting it is, and you'll have a blast. And the one thing that I want you all to think about as you're doing the symposium is just keep in mind how much you've gotten out of your research process and how much you want to be able to share that experience with your audience. And anything else beyond that really doesn't matter. And with that, I want to say thank you for coming. Have a great presentation at the symposium. I would love to see you afterwards. Tell me how it went, because I never get to go to the presentations. I'm working that day. I never get to see what you all do. So let us know how it goes. We love to hear that sort of thing. And at this point, have a great afternoon. And as I said, I will stick around for as long as anybody has any questions. So thanks. Any questions? Yeah.
Tips on nerves. When I speak, sometimes in front of an audience, I get this subconscious flutter in my chest, and I feel like my voice starts shaking.
So I get nervous. Sometimes my voice starts quivering, and I'm just shaking. So first of all, it can be a little weird, but just keep talking, even though your voice is shaking a little bit. You may find if your voice is shaking, speaking a little bit more clipped. Thank you. If you don't hold a pitch for a long time, nobody will notice that it's shaking. Another reason our voices can really start shaking is we don't put enough air behind it. So if you notice your voice starts quivering, maybe you need to breathe more often, and more deeply. Because when we get nervous, a lot of times all of our breath is going here. All of our support is here. So make sure when you're breathing, don't just, because that's not really productive, and it also forces your voice into really weird places that you don't want to be talking. But when you breathe, make a point, stop, and take a good breath, because then you'll have more air to throw through your voice. And also, it comes back to that, the more you can relax, the less your throat is going to tighten up. So breathe, calm down, and focus on the fact that this too will end. And the more you can do to stay comfortable through this process, the better. And again, the more you can prepare up front, the easier it is to get out of the nervous thing. Even though, as I say, this is uncomfortable, and it will be. But just accept that fact. And if all else fails, as I say, it will be over soon. Any other questions? Everybody's waiting around to see if somebody's going to ask the one question they want to know the answer for, but too shy to ask. Or just want to see if there's more information that they are going to miss. Anything else?
Was the one last week on oral presentations also posted on the website?
I believe it is already posted. If not, it should be within the next day or two. Yeah. Every workshop we've done on Symposium to date, I believe, is live on our website. Go to the Symposium page, scroll down to, I think it's Resources for Presenters, and it should be there. Yep. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on body movement while talking? Do you recommend walking?
Good question. Body movement, and just as a note, this is a new slide deck. Thank you for pointing out one of the things I missed. Body language. A lot of things go into that. First of all, I did mention, don't hide back here. If you are nervous, by the way, most rooms will have a lectern or something else that you can kind of surreptitiously lean on or grip with a total white-knuckled grip that nobody will notice but will get a lot of energy out of your system. In terms of gestures, people will tell you that the most natural way to speak is with your arms at your sides. It feels incredibly uncomfortable. It looks vaguely natural. I can't do it for very long. But find a neutral position that you can always come back to. The important thing in terms of hand motions is if you are constantly moving, then the times you make a really important gesture are lost. But if you find a neutral position, whatever it is, then when you want to make a point, you can. So find something neutral. The same thing goes for movement, for walking around. I see a lot of people, there are two extremes. One is the Greek statue. My feet are planted in stone and they're never going to move. And when I see that from an audience point of view, I start getting nervous because I can feel the tension in their legs and it starts infecting me. So don't just plant your feet and never move. The other extreme, of course, is the pacer who starts walking and never stops. And this is exactly the same as constantly moving your hands. It means nothing other than the fact that the speaker is nervous. For me, it is entirely natural to occasionally move. You got to take the pressure off of those legs. So take a step every now and then, but also be aware of what you're doing. You may be in a room where there's a projector, and if you're standing in a particular space, your head is being silhouetted on the screen, avoid that. The biggest thing is, with very few exceptions, don't plan the movement you're going to do. Just do something that feels normal, even if it's just shifting your weight a couple of times. You're going to be standing in front of an audience for 10 or 12 minutes. Standing just still for that is really uncomfortable. So move when it's natural. The other thing you can do, and same thing as with hands. If you really want to make a point, change your position, make the point. As you move, if you're doing it deliberately, your motions then take on importance. So don't necessarily plan it, but don't feel like you can't move. That was way longer an answer than you asked for, but hope that helps. Other questions? Yeah.
So just for the poster, are we just being asked like general questions, or do we have to prepare like a pitch presentation or something like that? I wasn't, because I've never done a poster presentation at all. So
Okay, so let me give you one thought first, and then I will get to answering your question. First of all, the question was, what should I be prepared to talk about with a poster? And I've never done a poster presentation, so I'm kind of worried about that sort of thing. So the one thing I want to suggest is the reason we do this symposium. Yeah, it's great hearing all of you talk about your research, but the single biggest reason we do this symposium is we want to give you all the opportunity to experience what it's like presenting at a professional conference, so that when you are doing this in a more, important setting, you've already done it. So this is a great practice experience, and I hope you will take it as such. In terms of what should you be ready to talk about for a poster, anything. I know that doesn't help. But as I said, be prepared for hi, tell me about your research. Because most people are not going to come up to your poster and spend the 2 minutes it takes to read everything on it. They're going to read your title, maybe they'll see your headings, maybe you got a picture that's really cool that they'll look at, but then they'll say, talk to me, tell me stuff. So definitely, I don't like calling it a pitch because to me that means you're trying to sell something, but definitely come up with the equivalent of an elevator speech. They get on the point of an elevator speech is you walk into a building, you get on an elevator, somebody gets on with you and they say, so tell me about something. And by the time you get off the elevator on whatever floor you're going to, you've gone through the entire content. So plan something for less than 2 minutes, just to talk about what your research is. The thing about a poster is you can't fit everything about your research on a poster. Same thing for an oral presentation. You can't cover your entire project in 10 minutes. So think about what you have deliberately left out. Be prepared to talk about that. Maybe the methods for your project are too long or too complicated to abbreviate into a small space on a poster. Somebody will come up and say, wow, those are great results. What'd you do to get them? Be prepared to talk about what you actually did. But ultimately, it comes down to be prepared to talk about all facets of your project because you never know what you're going to be asked. But that's why I suggest ask a lot of people to ask you questions so that you at least get a feel for what questions you might be asked up front. And then when the surprising ones come, you've got a little bit more mental energy to throw at it. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So as I say, have a great afternoon. If you're just waiting because you have a question that you think, this doesn't apply to anybody else, so I'll just wait until afterwards, I will stick around and answer as long as I need to, or as long as you would like me to. But otherwise, have a great afternoon, and I'll see you at the symposium.